So the magical stranger is a sub-tool of an overall tool in Hakomi that is something that we call providing missing experience. We grow up and develop throughout the world, through our lives, and we have things that are missing. There's many ways in which we can be missing nourishment in our lives. And so through Hakomi and through this assisted self-study, what we're really trying to shine a light on is the ways in which we have organized our lives to block out potential nourishment, even as adults.
Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. I have such an incredibly special treat for you. In this episode, I get the privilege of introducing you to my brother, Daniel Polk, to be exact. I'm bringing him on to this episode to talk about a concept that he shared with me that I learned from him, which he learned through his training in a specific modality called Hakomi. This concept is called the magical stranger. I really wanted to bring him on to talk about it because it is a creative, imaginal, fluid, experimental intervention that you can use with your students in real time. Now, it's important to note that Daniel, when we recorded this episode, was in his training. He is not a certified representative of this modality. So take it for what it is, which is that. But for all of those of you who are looking for creative ways to respond to students in difficult or stressful moments or moments where they're shut down, this is an episode that you're going to want to listen to. Before we get to the magical stranger part of the podcast, we take a little detour through Daniel's history through being a chef and into becoming a healing practitioner that he is today. So without further ado, I want to take us into the episode. Here we go. Well, hey there, Brother Daniel.
Hello.
Welcome to the Trauma Camp for Teachers podcast. It's really good to have you here.
Good to be here.
And thank you for bringing me a breakfast burrito this morning.
We need sustenance for sure.
We needed sustenance before we could start. So I'm really excited to share you with my audience. Can you just give them a little bit of an introduction?
Yeah.
To you.
It's a fun thing to examine how you would like to be received by the world.
Yeah.
Especially for me, since I'm in this midst of a big career change and a lot of growth and focus sort of shining on to new things for me. So I spent most of my life as a chef, and a year ago I walked away from kitchens completely and started training in Hakomi, which is a mindfulness and body-centered based psychotherapy. I've also done some trainings in coaching and have just launched a coaching practice aimed at young men to help them sort of find purpose in their life and develop their mature masculine, which is something that I think as a society we don't do. And so a lot of men are lost and searching for meaning.
I have a few questions. Can we go deeper down the rabbit hole?
Yeah.
So would you be interested or willing to share led you to leave chefery? Because you, just so everyone else knows, he was a pretty damn good chef. He had a really promising career right at your feet. And so that was a big choice.
Yeah, I had a pretty successful career and not just, financially successful or, being acknowledged by my peers, but success in a way that for most of it, I felt really fulfilled. I had mentored a lot of young cooks. I'd traveled internationally and cooked overseas. I just was able to really spread my wings and learn a lot and create a lot of amazing relationships. But that was at a cost. I worked 80 to 85 hours a week since the age of 19. I started cooking professionally when I was 15. It was my first professional cooking job. But since I was 19, I worked about 80 to 85 hours a week.
Which, can I just say, and I told you while you were doing it, I think is absolutely unreal.
It's nutty. Not that people should be calling other people crazy, but it's an insane thing.
It is insane. And I did not envy you for that.
No. And for a lot of those 85 hours, I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
It's a very odd paradox paradox. I guess most paradox are.
Yeah,
right?
they're paradoxical.
They're paradoxical. But yeah, it's what happens, at least what happened for me and what I've seen happen for many others, is that when you are in such close contact with a group of people working so closely, and I don't just mean working around the same product, I mean literally shoulder to shoulder, butt to butt sometimes, in a closed hot space, all trying to perfect a certain thing, even though you know perfection is unobtainable. You become very close with them. You learn what's going on in their family and personal lives, because the baby carrots that need to be blanched don't get blanched the right way if they're bringing in a bunch of energy.
Really?
Yeah. There's a cheesy thing from movies or on the Food Network, that says like, oh, you should have a little love in everything you make. Some people cook really well with love. Some people cook better with anger. And so learning how to read people, for sure, because
you're like, you're angry today, go handle the brisket.
Go handle the brisket. Yeah, totally. Yeah, people are nuanced, and the energy that they're bringing into the room, into the restaurant, into the kitchens is very important. It's sort of how they're looking at life.
So there's a lot of directions we can go. I'm going to try to keep it focused and contained. But one of the things that I do think is maybe helpful for teachers to be hearing and understand specifically about chef work and working in a kitchen is and I learned this from you, it tends to attract people. Who does it attract? Let me ask you this.
I heard somebody describe comedians, and they were comparing comedians to musicians. And they said they're attracted to dark spaces filled with dark people. And by the way, I love comedians and I love musicians. But kitchens also attract dark people.
Wounded
individuals. People. And one of the reasons that is true, there's a few that I'd like to touch on. One is that kitchens are often a place where fresh starts are allowed. Right? I've hired many ex-cons. I've had people who are recently out of a divorce, just moved across country, their other career, they experienced failure in their other career. It's a fresh start.
Yep.
The other is that because of the closeness I described, if somebody's broken, it comes from a wounded family, they have a new family that's willing to welcome them.
Yeah.
And because it's a family of wounded individuals,
there's acceptance.
There's acceptance. And we'll accept all of your ugliness and scars as long as you accept all of my ugliness and scars, right? And so there's this trade-off that's really beautiful. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of stagnation, right? Like it would be beautiful if everybody came together and then flourished and grew. But as we know, it takes a lot of work on an individual level, and you can't sort of rely on others.
Well, and that is, I think, true wherever you have a collection of wounded people, is if they are there to just be wounded together, that's where stagnation comes. But if there is some support around healing or nurturing or, compassion and providing some containment, people can start to stretch from the woundedness.
Yes.
And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, in your last job, didn't you try to start a men's group with some of your colleagues?
Yeah, it didn't take off too much.
Okay.
Mainly for logistical failures, trying to find time where we could sit around in a circle and talk about things, whether or not they were emotional things or this and that, trying to get a consistent group of men together after we've been spending time with each other and they have been away from their families, their girlfriends, their other responsibilities, animals that they have to care for at home. It's hard to ask a 26-year-old man who has a dog at home who needs to be walked, and he's been out of his house for 14 hours to come sit down with you. Yeah. We're going to cry together.
So a lot of some challenge with practical application, which in the world of trauma-informed teaching, those same hiccups can be present. Like, teachers know they need support, but how do you
prioritize
it over other things during the workday. So did you answer the question of why?
No, it's very, I went off on a long tangent, which I may do many times.
Did you lose focus, Daniel?
Oh no, I just think everything I have to say is important. So I felt fulfilled. I was working 80 to 85 hours. And then I noticed my passion starting to shift away. It wasn't that I didn't like cooking anymore. I still love it.
He cooked for us last night.
Yeah.
It's really good.
But it was that my focus was on the people that work for me, and creating lasting relationships with them that were sort of in a certain dynamic that I was helping them and supporting them in certain things.
Because you took mentoring really seriously.
Yes. It's not that all chefs do this.
No.
And in fact,
not at all.
Well, no, I mean, a lot of them do, but I will say, like, the word chef, Tom Colicchio, who's a very famous chef, really put it well in an early interview when he was named the executive chef at a very big restaurant in Manhattan, said, chef doesn't mean that I'm the best cook in the kitchen. It means that I do the ordering and I write the schedule, right? And there's some beautiful humility to that. And so when I sort of speak of who I wanted to be as an ideal chef, that included lessons that I learned from my mentor. And there are many mentors out there, but it's not everybody. But my mentor, Brendan Cox, when I was 19 years old, was the kind of man who led by example, and being present in my life as a shoulder to cry on and a person who gave me advice and started steering my career early on because he took interest in me is something that I wanted to replicate for my cooks and my sous chefs and my dishwashers. I mean, everybody from the top down. Yeah. So when I became a chef for the first time, an executive chef for the first time, that desire was just a part of who I wanted to be.
The desire to
be, the mentor, the guide, right? That was just a piece of who I wanted to be. And over the years, it started growing and growing and growing. And I was no longer interested in developing innovative new dishes or
the business
side of it. And I just wanted to focus on that. Yeah. And, I had always been interested in psychology and spirituality. And so when I discovered Hakomi on the client side a little bit, and because a mentor of mine sort of pushed me in that way, I realized that this was a skill set that was a combination of two things that I love a lot, which is spirituality and psychology. Yeah. And so I thought, I'm just going to jump head in and go for it.
Okay. So over time, you came to this awareness that your heart wasn't necessarily steeped in the world of chefery anymore, but was pivoting to people.
Yes.
And serving people and helping people heal, continue on their best life journey, whatever that is. So you enter into Hakomi training and are also doing life coach training as well, and really learning how to work with people.
Yeah.
Tell us, for the lay person, most people don't know what Hakomi is. So just give us a snapshot.
So the sentence, I think I said it earlier, which is, I think part of the subtitle of the main Hakomi textbook is it's a mindfulness-based and body-centered psychotherapy. The founder of it, Ron Kurtz, who's passed now, but once said in an interview, and I love it, the way he described Hakomi was that it's a assisted self-study.
Ooh.
Yeah. So we're not as the Hakomi therapist or practitioners, and there's a distinction there. If you are already a licensed therapist, you can sort of take on the title after you've studied and had supervision. You can take on the title of Hakomi therapist. And if you're not licensed, maybe you don't have a master's in psychology or mental health or social work, you can learn the process and become a Hakomi practitioner.
Yeah.
Certified Hakomi practitioner through the Hakomi Institute. And it's a rigorous process with lots of supervision and many skills needed to be learned and practiced.
Yeah. So it's interesting because One of the things so part of your training is that you do these like 3-day weekends,
Yes.
like intensive, immersive group study where you're actually learning how to practice Hakomi with other adults.
Yeah, it's sort of designed like a master's program for working professionals.
Yeah, like a hybrid.
Right. So at home, you're doing the reading, you're studying the method in theory on the page, all that sort of stuff. And then when you get in person, yes, there's some lectures, but what we really are working on are the skills. And from the first week, on the first day, we had a short lecture, learned a skill, and then broke off into dyads or triads and practiced the skill.
Okay, what was that?
Terrifying.
I know.
right.
Shaking in my boots over here.
Well, you want the most important thing in I think any psychotherapy or sort of healing relationship between a provider and a client is safety.
Yeah.
Right. And it is definitely the person sitting in the, chair of power, the therapist or the doctor or whoever, to be concentrated and concerned with creating that safety.
Yeah.
And so you jump right in and you know that the people that you're working with, they're also students. They have also done introspective work on their own. They've done either therapy or meditation or assisted self-study, whatever. And so you know that they're game, they're ready, but you don't want to cause harm, right? Like you just do not want to cause harm. And not only do you not want to cause harm, you have, like, at least I did, and I know many people have reported, you have that little critic inside of you saying like, you're bad at this. You're not going to do this, right? And so you pair that with not wanting to cause harm. Hello.
And you have a frozen person or insecure, fearful.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and yes, you're frozen and you're fearful. You can be frozen and you can be fearful, and you can learn how to walk through those two things. And that is why the way the Hakomi training is set up is so powerful, is because it forces you to walk through it.
Yeah.
Right. And they provide safety. Not only are there 3 trainers who are master therapists, but they then have 3 to 4 assistants in the class who have graduated from the training, are maybe under supervision so they can become certified Hakomi therapists or practitioners. And so those assistants are floating around the room. The trainers are floating around the room. If you ever needed any help, somebody would be there. And so to sort of create this environment of safety for the students to become safe providers for their clients is great.
I mean, that infrastructure alone is obviously, that I'm early on in the building the trauma camp training programs, but that infrastructure to be able to walk through kind of scary stuff or what can feel scary, I would love to find a way to create that one day. I think it's so important, and I want to pause here just to acknowledge this, because what you said about feeling scared and having the little critic inside, and then also not wanting to cause harm, I think teachers experience that a lot, right? So they're learning a lot about trauma-informed care. They're learning new relational skills for how to work with distrusting students. And I think those two things might be really present for them, right? I don't want to hurt the kid. I want to do this right. I don't want to F up. And so it's hard to manage.
It is hard to manage. And just to sort of keep heaping on praise for Hakomi and the Hakomi method and the training, is the other part of the training is that the students in the training are being taught, me included, we are being taught how to be mindful of our present state, right? Because we can't ask others to be mindful of their present state if we are not first mindful of ours.
Yeah. Ooh. We cannot teach others to be mindful of their present state if we first are not.
Yes.
Okay.
And so, we as students need to be present about how we're experiencing class or practice sessions right then and there.
Yeah.
And we need to be able to pull it back a little bit further and say, okay, how am I experiencing this as in the client's chair? How am I experiencing this in the therapist chair? Right? We play all these roles in a training. I am, if I break up into a triad and we have practice sessions all weekend long with that triad, I am an observer at one point, I am a therapist at one point, and I'm a client at one point. And in all those roles, I'm a student.
Yeah.
And then in all those roles, I'm just a human being with my own energy and own history, right? So bringing that mindfulness into a Hakomi world and realm and context, I think would be great for teachers, right?
Well, you have a few teachers in your program, don't you?
Yes, I do. There's two. One who works with young children. I believe her students are fifth graders, but I could be wrong. And then another who's a teacher in physical health. So meaning like she teaches yoga, she teaches, aerobics classes, that sort of things. And that's just my cohort. My cohort is a fairly small cohort in North Carolina.
Yeah.
And so there's Hakomi trainings all over the country and internationally in Japan and in Spain. And so Hakomi's really, this has grown and is continuing to grow. And there's teachers in all of those.
So there's application outside of the psychotherapy office, which is why, Daniel, I brought you on the podcast today is because there's there's lots of parts of Hakomi that I think would be extraordinarily beneficial to teachers working with kids, and traumatized or not traumatized. But one that really caught my eye is this thing that you've learned in as an intervention. Would you call it an intervention?
Yes.
In Hakomi, and it's called the magical stranger.
Yeah.
Tell us about the magical stranger.
I will gladly tell you about it. I do want to say, as I keep talking about Hakomi, that I am not a certified Hakomi practitioner.
Yeah.
I am about to complete my first year of a 2-year training, and then that will be followed by supervision. So I'm speaking to you as a student of this, as opposed to an expert or anybody who's been certified, just to sort of be clear on that.
Yeah.
Because I do speak so eloquently, you may be confused. So the magical stranger is a sub-tool of an overall tool in Hakomi that is something that we call providing missing experience.
Okay, wait. So there's a tool that practitioners use called providing a missing experience.
Yes.
Tell us about the point of that.
So whether it's from big T traumas or little T traumas, right? We grow up and develop throughout the world, through our lives, and we have things that are missing, right? Whether that's loving nourishment, whether that's physical nourishment, maybe, some children don't get healthy meals, right? Mm-hmm. And that is a form of neglect, right? Whether it's support and encouragement, there's many ways in which we can be missing nourishment in our lives. And so through Hakomi and through this assisted self-study, what we're really trying to shine a light on is the ways in which we have organized our lives to block out potential nourishment, even as adults.
Okay, why would someone want to block out potential?
Nobody wants to, right? It is a learned skill set, usually developed at a very young age, right? So children are underdeveloped, right? They don't know how to develop skills and ways to sort of work through these little traumas or big traumas or neglectful things in a way that lets them go and experience life in a full and loving and nourishing way.
Right. So we're organized to seek out what we know, and we don't know what we don't know. Right. So if we grow up with abusive or neglectful or a combination of those environments, we just find ways to recreate that, because through that, one, it's familiarity. And then two, we know that we can get, even if it's in a maladaptive way, we can get connection in that way.
Yes.
And what we don't know is that in that process, we might be blocking out nourishment.
Yes, completely.
And you're talking sometimes physical nourishment, sometimes emotional nourishment, sometimes all of it nourishment.
Completely. And there's another layer to this, which is something of interest of mine, although I'm not studied or practiced in it, but there's also the neuroscience to this all, right? Which I do in my training. That's great.
Yeah.
Which is like, we have a baseline from how we've developed over time, and our neurons, if I'm speaking correctly, you can correct me, they want to be a certain way because they have always been that way.
Yes.
Or for many, many years been that way.
Well, there's a term, it's called the neurons that fire together, wire together. So if my experiences make certain neurons fire together, if that happens enough, it's going to create a kind of like muscle tissue, like a stronger muscle tissue for those neurons. And that's why what happens in the earliest years of our life, it sets the template for later in life. Doesn't mean it can't be changed, but it's the hardwiring that happens. Yeah. Which, by the way, I learned from Dr. Bruce Perry and his neurosequential model training. And so I'm not the expert on that, but I've gone through enough trauma trainings to know that that's what happens.
Yeah. So it's all fascinating to me. And so to bring it back to the original question, so missing experience can be as simple as a therapist providing missing experience by having loving presence every time they see the client. Right? Some people didn't have any relationships, even if it was with their parents or teachers at school they didn't have any relationships where they just experienced loving compassion.
And that being the intervention itself. It's not some major, tell me.
Yeah, we don't have to do a special guided meditation. I don't need you to cry for me. Right? You don't have to perform anything. You don't have to remember your most traumatic event, right? Honestly, that can come later. That can come never. Yeah. Because one of the interventions is just showing up with loving, compassionate presence.
And sometimes that in and of itself is providing a missing experience.
Completely.
I do want to say, I think that is one of the major relational interventions that teachers are utilizing all the time that they might not know that they are doing this for a child. And sometimes you will explicitly know. Like two of my best teachers in high school, Francine Watson and Judson Miller, shout out. I don't even know if trauma informed was a thing at the time. I'm pretty sure it wasn't, but they provided a missing experience for me of a loving, consistently loving, caring, attentive adult, each of them individually. So shout out, I love you too. Bye. So there's the big tool of providing this missing experience. And then there's this sub tool of the magical stranger.
Yeah. So the one thing to note about both the big tool and the small tool is that as with everything in Hakomi, it is what you are experiencing in the present moment.
Got it. Right? Not what happened last week, not what happened 3 years old, not what you think they might want, but it's
this is where it sort of becomes like Kung Fu, right?
Yeah.
Which is a session might revolve around a traumatic event when you were 5.
Okay.
The assisted self-study of Hakomi will remind you, guided by the therapist, to keep your focus on what you are experiencing in your body in the present moment as you are talking about the traumatic event when you were 5 years old. So we can write mini stories. We can weave together narratives that tell us, when I was 5 years old, this thing happened to me and it was because my dad was neglectful or my dad was an alcoholic or this or that or whatever. We can make up stories. And when I say make up, I don't mean make believe. I mean, we can sort of assign meaning to different events in our lives. But in Hakomi, what we are trying to study is the present moment.
What happened when you were 5 might be showing up
completely
right now.
Completely.
Which is exactly what trauma does.
Exactly. And whether it's in the body, in certain memories that are triggered, in certain impulses, right? And this is where the body becomes a resource and a tool. If we can track our bodies, then we can track our present experience.
Right.
Right?
Okay.
So with the magical stranger, it is when, while studying something from childhood, the client What?
I'm so sorry. I'm like trying to hold in a laugh from like 2 minutes ago because your hand movement was so many. The audience can't see it, but this is just me regressing into little sister mode for a second. I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just need to get the laugh out. Okay.
This is where 10 years ago I would have left.
We've come a long way. Okay, yeah. So I'm so sorry.
Maybe
continue.
Yeah. So the magical stranger is still a present experience, okay, but you are working with a client who is in a child state.
Okay, so let's just describe a child state for a real quick second. I thought Helen Keller said this, but I cannot find her quote on this. So maybe I just said it and assigned it to her, but that we carry inside of us every age we've ever been. And so we all have the potential to regress into a child state. If I'm 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, I still hold the capacity in my physical body and my mental brain to regress to 3 years old, 7 years old, 9 years old, a child state. And so if I'm hearing you correctly, the tool of using this magical stranger, which you'll describe in a second, is for when someone has regressed into a child state.
Yes.
For an adult. We'll talk about how this applies to children in a second. But
so when an adult goes into a child state, again, the focus is always going to be on safety. And so a magical stranger is a tool that can be used to safely navigate through this child state, okay, without having them get reactivated, without their nervous system being supercharged, right? Okay. And it's honestly a little bit of make-believe, right?
So, okay, I just want to pause on that too. This is one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on this to talk about the magical stranger, is because I think there's oftentimes this idea that like therapeutic interventions like come directly from a book, or that you go to a course and you learn all these concrete things. And a lot of therapeutic interventions are really like a combination of, yes, some things that you've learned about safety, some things like reflecting or mirroring or grounding. But a lot of them are like very off the cuff and very in the moment, kind of spontaneous, kind of like pulling together what you know about the situation in this child in this moment and how regulated you are. And so there is a lot of creativity involved.
Yes. There's an interesting side note I'd make on that, which is up until not too long ago, I don't know the exact year, but psychology degrees were bachelors of arts. You can get a bachelor's of arts in psychology. And the reason I find that interesting is, one is because it was this, to use sort of a bad term, but it was a pseudoscience, right? Because it was all
big role.
It was all unproven theory, right?
Yeah.
And that's, that's in science.
By Western standards.
By Western standards. You want a hypothesis and you want it to be proven, right? Or disproven. And so it was sort of this culmination of a lot of theory but I think sort of labeling it as an art and with creativity is really important. And I could talk about Hakomi forever, and that's why I agreed to come onto this podcast. But because it is a creative thing. It is a mixture of so many. It's a mixture of Eastern and Western philosophies. Hakomi is actually a Hopi Indian word.
Do you know what it means?
Yes, it means, and I'm gonna try not to butcher this. So give me a second to compose my thoughts.
We can edit this.
Okay, hold on. Then let me look it up.
Yeah.
Because I could say it, but it's so Hakomi is a Hopi Indian word meaning how do you stand in relation to these many realms? Yeah, right. So
how do you stand in relation to these many realms?
Yeah. So you can really unpack that, and we could spend an hour and a half just on that. But so it's a mix. There's roots in Taoism and Buddhism. There's roots in Western psychology and Jungian psychology. All of this stuff. right? And it comes together. It's a really beautiful and creative art form. And so it actually encourages Hakomi practitioners and therapists to lean on their creativity.
So this is really important too, because as with trauma-informed care, there's the science of trauma, and then the art is emergent when we're like, okay, now how do we apply this to the people we're serving? So that's really powerful. Okay.
Yeah. So I think the best way for me to describe the magical stranger is to give you an example of it.
Okay.
So
wait, no, can you say like, so let's just kind of provide a little container before you give the anecdote. The magical stranger is essentially a stranger that's magical.
That's magical.
So it's a what's the word I'm thinking of? It's a conjured idea that is used to provide one of those missing experiences.
Yes.
So this magical stranger is not a real person. It's not a real thing, but it's brought into a moment where someone has gone into a child state to see if we can correct it.
Yes. And this is like Kung Fu 101.
Yep.
Hakomi level, which is, so you are providing a missing experience to somebody in a child state. So which in a simple view would look like you're providing a missing experience for an already lived experience.
Yes.
Right? But Hakomi takes that one step further, which is once you have navigated through this child state with the magical stranger, you then bring your client back to study themselves and how it is in the present moment to have witnessed their child memory, their child state being met with a missing experience.
Okay.
Right? So I only say that.
There's a lot of like inception.
Yes. And the reason I think that's important is because I don't think it's enough if you are to just bring people into child states, which can be overwhelming, right? And they can be fully charged, and then just give them this make-believe missing experience. You need to tie it into the present experience, right? And this is what like what many spiritual practices teach us, which is there is nothing other than the present experience, right? And Taoism puts it beautifully, which is like everything happens for a reason, right? And that phrase has been abused in media and written word, but everything happens for a reason. And that reason is unique and beautiful to everything, right? And so I often think of Taoism as flowing water and how it erodes the land underneath it that it's flowing through, right? And how it just constantly is changing. And is just moving. And that's a beautiful sentiment. And so the idea with this magical stranger is that we want to provide this missing experience, both for the child state client and for them to witness themselves having that experience.
As if it happened.
As if it happened.
Yeah. As a felt experience.
Well, because it did.
Yeah.
This is the play on words. This is the nuance and much of the art, which is it did happen in this moment, in this room with you sat across from me.
Yeah.
Right. And that is a powerful shared missing experience.
Yeah. I have a story on that too, but I want you first to share your example of what the magical stranger can be.
So my example comes from a practice session. This is at a weekend with a fellow student.
And just so y'all know, there's no identifying information being shared. So this is, is completely anonymous.
Yeah. So we were instructed, this is often how our practice sessions go, because we are practicing to become therapists, but also we are students in real time. If you're the client, don't bring in your biggest wound, right? But bring in something that you sort of remember from childhood that you can be interested and curious and working on, and not let it take over your whole day, because you still need to act as a student. The student client that I had told me about this time when she had gone to a new school and she was really, really scared, and how she described this fear is that she was bundled up, sitting crisscross applesauce in the middle of the playground.
Can I pause you? About how old was she at this time?
About 6 or 7.
So she's in the present moment recalling this memory.
Yeah, and this is often what happens when you're working with somebody in a child state. Her voice got a little softer.
Yeah.
Her body language got a little tighter, actually, because she started embodying that memory.
Yes.
Right. So I actually don't remember if she was sitting cross-legged, but I could sort of see her whole body lift, her shoulders rise up, right? And it's just sort of a tightness and a protection. Yeah, is what I interpreted as.
Yeah, kind of creating a shell out of her.
Yeah. And so while her body was rising up, meaning her shoulders and her back, her head was going down and down into her lap. Yeah. And this is what she described. This is how she described herself sitting in the middle of the playground. And from this really sort of protected, cocooned place, I'll also note that from that place, she is missing the experience of life.
Yeah. So if you could see my brother, it's like he's kind of a body that's turned inward on itself. The head is down, the back is kind of hunched, curved inward.
Shoulders up so high they're probably muffling her ears.
Yeah, it's a real physical manifestation of shutdown and potentially shame.
Yes. And so she's there and she can sort of hear the children around her. And there's girls who are playing, and what they're playing, I don't know. Maybe they're playing tag, maybe they're playing hopscotch, but she's painting this picture, and I'm realizing that she is just completely in this frozen, fearful state. And so I start contacting her and talking to her like she's that 6 or 7 year old, right? With really slowed down speech, compassion, and which is interesting too, because I'm a very loud, jovial person.
Totally.
Right. And so me learning how to develop this voice is a new skill. Yeah. Right. But so I'm contacting her. I'm talking to her a little slower. And as she keeps describing it, she's telling me, I feel like I really want to go play, but I'm scared. I'm scared that they're not going to like me. I'm scared of meeting new people. And what she's really saying is that she's scared of rejection, yes. Right? Yeah. And that the version of being alone right now is better than the version that she's made up in her head, that if she gets rejected, not only will she be alone, but she'll also be rejected. Yeah. Right. And so staying in this closed off state, even though it's sad and fearful and probably miserable for a 6 or 7 year old girl, is better than the fear-based alternative that she has in her mind. Yeah. Right. And so as we're talking, and this is, by the way, very slow. Right. This is just real slow back and forth, really sort of letting the present moment be felt and experienced. I asked her if she'd be up for an experiment. And she said yes. And this is important because in Hakomi, as what we call experiments are oftentimes in other modalities called interventions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I like that.
But in Hakomi, one of our big principles is nonviolence. So we're always contracting with our clients.
To get consent.
Yeah. Right. And
do you want to do this?
Yes.
Are you willing to
do this? I'm going to describe what I have as an idea for an experiment, and you can take what you want and leave the rest. Right. So it's always this little back and forth discussion, and it can be done implicitly. It can be done in a very casual manner, depending on your level of comfort with the client and their level of safety. But you want to just always be making these little contracts with the client, right? So I said, hey, I have this idea for an experiment. The student client knows that we're practicing this skill set, right? So
she's a fully grown adult. Yeah. You're in Hakomi training session.
We know that we're working on the magical stranger, right? So she knows what's coming next, right? So she consents and she agrees. And I said, well, what's funny is that I can hear that you're afraid. And what's amazing about that fear is that I have a solution for that. I've been a bodyguard to 6 and 7 year old little girls my entire life. And the only sad part about me being a bodyguard to 6 or 7 year old girls my entire life is I don't have any girl to protect today. I don't have a job.
So just for the record, this is completely off the cuff.
The cuff.
Actually.
This is me. I don't need, yeah. I don't know how you'd put that on your resume. Yes, bodyguard to 6 or 7 year old girls. As soon as they turn 8, I drop them.
Like, you need to be interviewed by the police department.
Yeah. So this is off the cuff. And by the way, as an experience of being a student and tracking myself while I'm going through this, I'm thinking to myself, this is nuts.
You're like, what just came out of my mouth?
Yes, right? Like, I spent my entire career standing, looking menacing, yelling at cooks to go faster, make it taste better, right? And now I'm like, I'm a bodyguard to little girls, you know? But that is fun, and it's big because what's interesting about this is that I matched her age.
You matched her age, and you matched her kind of like psychological level. Like a 30-year-old is not going to be like, yeah, sure, be my bodyguard, you know, but someone who's in a child state or a child themselves they're going to tap into that possibility.
Yeah.
Right. So like, oh, you've been a bodyguard
Totally
for girls just like me.
Just like me.
Yeah.
Right. And I also added this other layer, which I don't have a solid reasoning behind it, except that I sort of thought like this little girl, this child state would want to do me a favor. So what I added in was that I'm out of a job.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
yeah.
And
so she'd be helping you out.
She would be helping me. And it, as with any make-believe, if you have, I mean, your listeners are teachers, so they have experience with kids all the time.
Yeah.
I have a limited exposure to kids. But when I hang out with my nieces and nephew, make-believe is all in the details.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't know if you remember that commercial a few years ago where it looks like a kid is steering a pirate ship through the storm.
I do remember that.
The waves are crashing over, the thunder is going.
Yeah.
And then it just sort of like pulls back and you see this kid on a plastic playground set.
Yeah.
Right. And it's so the details are what is important in make-believe.
Yeah.
And anything you can do to slow this down and make it even on a more granular level, something for them to think about.
Yeah.
So I said, yeah, I'm out of a job. Do you think you could hire me? Would you be willing to let me protect you? Right. And she said, yeah. You know,
I don't know where we're going with this, but okay.
And so I said, great. And I'm now enthusiastic because I am now a man with a purpose, right, in this world. And so I became curious. I said, well, in what ways would you want me to protect you? And that's a big question for a 6 or 7-year-old. I probably jumped the gun with something that was too big, right? And if I didn't notice her immediate sort of squinting of her eyes and her forehead, her brow furrowing, and I wasn't tracking her, I might not have noticed that. And so I would have allowed her to start thinking about it, and it probably would have taken her out of her child state, right? Okay. So I noticed this, I tracked this. I made a little bit of a mistake. Okay, we can remedy this. So then I just actually interrupt because she's going, right? And she started to think. So I switch back and I say, well, it looks like there's some girls over there playing. Would you like to play with them? And she said, yeah. And I said, is that scary to you? She said, yeah. I said, well, I can protect you from them. And she said, okay. And so then I asked a smaller question. I said, do you want me to be sort of mean and scary? She said, no. Right. Which is the gentleness of a 6 and 7-year-old. Yeah. Right. And I said, well, do you just want me to be there with you? She said, and that didn't fit right. So then I said, well, do you want me to go ask them if they want to play? Right. And so I am now taking over the thing that she is most afraid of. Right. So when you're frozen with fear, if you can have somebody else come do the thing that you're afraid of. Oh, yeah. Oh, right. Right. Like it's why. Yeah.
It's why those notes of like, you know, a friend will pass along one of those notes that's like, will you go out with Jessica? Yeah. It's because Jessica's so afraid to ask, you know, so we need friends. We need our support system to be, you know, recruited to, to that end.
Right. And so she said, yes, you know, and as soon as she said yes, her body started to open a bit. Right. It wasn't full. It wasn't immediate, as with most things, right? Like these changes that you track in a client or in yourself, right? You may have been holding something for years. And let's not pretend that like a random student therapist in training is going to ask one question and you're going to be like, oh, full release, I'm free at last, It's not going to happen. But it's the little shifts, and those little shifts are amazing because that's new experience for you in your body, right? Mm-hmm. And so we played it out a little bit. It wasn't very long, mainly because, then the little bell rang in our class and it's like time to wrap it up, so we come to a safe place to stop. But I went over to those imaginary little girls and I asked if they could play. They said, yes, we've been wanting to play with her. So I provided that little detail too, right? Mm-hmm. Because so often in our fear, especially about interpersonal relationships, we think that people don't want us.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And oftentimes when we open our hearts and we walk through that fear, we find that people have been wanting us for so long.
Yeah.
So I tried to give that. And I'm not a master therapist. I'm not even a licensed therapist, right? So this is all sort of conjecture. And I wonder if in 10 years I'll look back and say like, that was appropriate, or maybe that was a little far reaching,
right?
Or projecting my own stuff, right? Like we bring all of our stuff into our sessions. But I think it's this beautiful slowness. And we spent, 15 minutes in this practice session, and she experienced something completely new in a child state compared to what she experienced as a child.
She experienced an adult, a loving, protective adult, come and help her achieve what she wanted.
Yeah.
Rather than letting her stay in the collapsed state and be alone.
Yes.
Through the medium of this magical stranger, which just came, you created
on air. Like it really was a reach.
Yes.
And I wasn't sure it was going to work.
Yeah.
I could have said, hey, I'm a bodyguard for 6 to 7 year old girls. And she goes, that's weird.
Yeah.
I don't want a bodyguard.
Yeah.
Right. And in which case I would have adapted and moved in a different direction. But
what would you have done in that case? How do you pivot if someone's like, no, that's not the magical stranger I want?
So if they're fully in a child state, right, then I would try to find a new magical stranger experience.
Yeah.
If they're just dipping their toe in the child state and they're not fully committed, I would invite them to study why they're rejecting it.
Got it. So that
right. And not in a demeaning way, not like, oh, interesting. You don't want this.
Yeah.
Right. But like, what about it don't you want?
Totally.
Right.
So, okay. So we walked through what the magical stranger can look like when you're applying it to adults who are visiting a child state. How do we apply this to working with actual children who, because they're children, are always in a child state? So one of the things that I'm thinking in terms of how to apply this to working with children, because this is specifically a type of experiment or relational intervention or healing modality for adults that you use with adults with their consent. And it's different from, like, you're not going to do this necessarily with a child who is in your classroom in the middle of the day, right? But there are facets of this that we can translate to working with children. And the main part of the magical stranger that I think is so important is it's fundamentally a caring adult showing up to help you out of a stuck or distressed state.
Yes.
And being willing to do so creatively.
And this is a thing that's very important, especially when we hear this term. The term is non-violently.
Yeah.
Right. When we hear the term non-violent, we think, well, as long as I'm not throwing punches or throwing rocks through a glass window, then I'm non-violent, right? Well, no. If the non-violent way to help a child in that stuck state is to meet them where they're at, right? And say to them in whatever words need to come out or whatever actions or energy needs to be shared with them. But is to say, like, where you are at is perfectly okay, right? Yeah. Because it is where you're at.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
And so I want to sort of come meet you there, and then and only then can I hold your hand as we walk out. Right? It's finding this It's meeting in the dark forest of whatever stuckness is there and saying, once we've established where we're starting from together, then we can walk through the trees and get out and find some light and some safety. Right. And so that is where the magical stranger's creativity comes into play and the nonviolence comes into play.
So this actually, it makes a lot of sense to me too, because I know you were doing a practice session in the anecdote you described, but I can actually see a real 5 or 6 year old girl on the playground, or child of any gender, kind of hunched over, having a tough time. Maybe they just moved to the school. Maybe they've been there, however many years, but are having a rough day, and they're hunched over. And I can imagine a adult who notices and an adult who cares coming over and checking in with them, and even recruiting them. Like, you can recruit yourself in this make-believe way. Well, guess what? I know I'm your PE teacher, but I also happen to be a bodyguard for 5 to 6 year old little girls. And this is what I think is really powerful, because this is how you harness the relationship to help create safety for students. I actually had one little anecdote that I wanted to share too, that it was a colleague of mine when we were in a graduate program together. And I knew instantly that what we were doing was providing a corrective experience. So this was a friend of mine, and he had extraordinary anxiety around speaking in front of people. And as per most graduate classes, you have to do some sort of presentation at some point. And he was terrified. And so when it came his turn, he stood up in front of the class and immediately started dripping sweat, and his voice was shaking, and his hands were shaking with his cue cards, and he kept apologizing. I'm so sorry. I'm really nervous. So sorry. And after about 30, 45 seconds of him just trying to regulate himself, from that audience, I say, hey, and I won't say his name, but hey, you, hey there, man, would it be helpful if we averted our eyes and turned around? And immediately, so I was just throwing it out there as potentially a corrective experience that could help him just regulate. And I wasn't even thinking like, let's give him a corrective experience, but I was just like, let's help him feel safer. Would it be helpful if we all turned around and averted our eyes? And immediately he let out this deep breath and said, yeah. And so we all turned around, and immediately the sweat, not that I knew it at the time, but the sweat stopped, the voice stopped shaking, and he gave a tremendous presentation. And most of it was speaking anyway. We didn't need to, we had the printout slides in front of us. And I thought about this later, because as a kid, he was probably kind of forced to do presentations like that throughout his entire educational journey, and never had either, I was an adult, but I was his peer in that moment. Never had anyone kind of step in to provide that kind of corrective experience. And a corrective experience essentially brings safety to an unsafe situation. And so I think I guess what I want to say as we wrap this up is, I think there are a lot of creative ways to bring a magical stranger in, or be the magical stranger ourselves. And it is speaking to the art part of providing trauma-informed care. So now that I've spoken so much, Daniel, it has been such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure to be here and talk about this stuff. It's something I'm very passionate about, and I think it is a work that can be far-reaching into many different professions and aspects of life. And I'm excited to share it and have some teachers be able to listen to it and sort of maybe hopefully learn something new. And I would also say, and I'm not being paid by Hakomi to say this, but there are workshops offered year round. Now it's going to be a little more difficult with COVID, but they're transitioning to online only workshops and things like that. And potentially, I know they can be used for continuing education credits for therapists, but potentially there's some continuing education there for teachers. And so if this is something that sounds interesting to you, and in your busy time and busy lives also need to fulfill your CEs, then this could be something to do. So I'm just throwing it out there, but it's a wonderful thing.
So I will have all the links mentioned in the episode available on our show notes page. And yeah, I think there was so much from this episode to munch on. Thank you for being a guest.
Of course.
All right,
Thank you.
So that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening in to me chop it up with my big brother, Daniel, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.